Welcome back to the Smarter Marketer podcast, brought to you by Rocket Agency. I'm your host, James Lawrence.
Welcome back to the Smarter Marketer podcast. I'm here today with Nick Palmer from House of Brand. Nick, welcome back to the pod.
Hey, James. How you doing?
I am very, very well. It's been a while, I think 18 months or so since we last had you onto the pod. And
At least, yeah.
So, Nick, I went to Forward Sydney a few months ago, listened to Byron Sharp talk, put out just my summary of his presentation, and it's kind of incredible. I think I posted it on a Thursday, I think, in Sydney, and it kind of took off to the extent that I think by Friday afternoon it had, maybe 5 to 10,000 impressions and, maybe 60 to 100 people engaging with it. And then for what I think Byron himself kind of engaged with it, and it just went ballistic. It kind of, by the end, it's, I don't know, seen 100,000 times or something like that. And it's got 1,000 engagements from marketers all around the world, people in Germany, people in Brazil commenting and asking me all those questions and me jumping in and responding. And I think on the back of it, you said, we should do a pod. It's obviously a space that you play a lot in. I think it'd be good to have a chat with you, I guess, as to the resonance of that post and kind of where marketers are with it as we kind of get the midway point of 2025.
Yeah, I think the reason it took off is because of this. Well, probably it took off because Byron responded, and therefore it goes out to a fairly wide network and all of that kind of stuff. And he doesn't always respond, so when he does, people notice it. But that is part of a bigger thing around this real interest, focus, attention on, let's call it marketing science, marketing effectiveness, actual empirical understanding of how marketing actually works, which Byron and Eric Mogbass Institute and their books, How Brands Grow, etc., were kind of one of the earlier kind of pieces out there that got widespread acclaim, read by everyone on everyone's bookshelves, things like that. So it's definitely it feels like the era of marketing effectiveness. And so there's a lot of talk about lots of those different areas. And whether it's everyone doing Mark Ritzen's mini MBA or people doing the Masters of Effectiveness with James Herman, which I've done, or people, or Rory Sutherland's blowing up on TikTok and things like that, any of those kind of things talks this kind of fascination with kind of not fascination. There is some fascination, but also this kind of renewed drive towards looking at actually how marketing really works. And I think the other thing is it's risen as an antidote to the highly measurable world of, what do you want to call it, performance marketing. It's not all digital, obviously, and that's a silly phrase to use, but that world of thing, vanity metrics, all that kind of stuff, easily measurable, below the line activity, etc., has obviously meant there was a tip in favor of budgets pushing towards that space rather than brand building. And it's kind of risen as a bit of an antidote to that, I think, starting with the long and the short of it, the Peter Field and Les Binet book, which started making the case. And a lot of the stuff has really built on that. It's all very similar themes, most of it, but all using slightly different language to describe the same thing. But there have been some particularly interesting things recently.
I'm surprised you didn't have a little jab at me, because Nick and I think it was during COVID, we thought it'd be fun to enroll in the Ritson mini MBA, and Nick may or may not have passed with a higher grade than I did.
I can't actually remember, but yes, I do remember swapping notes on the case study, which they do actively encourage you to do, actually, which is a good thing, right? Because it's like you don't do business alone, so why not share notes and things? So it was good. It was good.
I'll maintain that you sabotage me.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I stole all your good ideas. Yeah.
So what are you seeing? Like, maybe we talk, you don't necessarily have to talk specifically, but the types of clients that you work with, you've got a pretty interesting mix at House of Brands. So I think it'd be, don't give away anything you can't, but I think the types of businesses you work with and kind of where they're at in their journey around this conversation.
Yeah, I think so. We work with some of the bigger end of town, the Combanks and Woolworths of the world, for those of you in Australia. So some of the, the biggest brands in Australia, probably two of the 3 or 4 biggest brands in Australia, right down to startups, charities, things like that. I'd say at the top end of town, maybe things haven't changed that much. They've always invested in brand. That's why they're the biggest brands in Australia. They've got plenty of budget to spread around and put it into different buckets and pots for performance versus brand and all those kind of things. So that maybe at that end, it hasn't changed that much. But it's more at the smaller end of town. And when I say, I mean, smaller is of course most of the businesses out there, of course, and most of the marketing that happens. I think there we've seen a little bit more switch to, we haven't got much money to play with. Where's that best placed? And actually, well, either coming to the conclusion or wanting the evidence and seeking out the evidence that helps tell that story internally of the best thing we can do is invest it in brand. Or at least, sorry, not necessarily all of it in brand, but let's not fall into the trap of going, well, we've only got so much money, so we must make that all work for us in terms of direct performance, immediate return, etc. That's probably where we've seen, I'd say we've seen the biggest shift, not just in terms of the actual output, but in terms of the mindset or what they're looking to do. And I think that's where all the stuff has really helped. It's helped those marketers have those conversations with those the C-suite, the holders of the purse strings, to go, this is the right thing to be doing. This is all the evidence, not just marketing theory, but actual empirical evidence that shows that this is what we should be doing with this money. So I think a lot of that is, I wouldn't say it's driving it, but it's where you're seeing a lot of the change.
It's it is an interesting one. I'm like, I guess my career has been built more on that performance side, right? Where at the very beginning it was, literally doing paid search ads before Google had a paid search platform in the country, right? And kind of riding that wave. And we would, like in my business prior to Rocket, it was like we would go out there and we'd go to businesses and say, hey, like, you're putting all this money into yellow pages or outdoor advertising. The old adage of, I know half my marketing budget's wasted. I just don't know which half. And we'd say that we can prove it to you. Give us whatever it might be, give us 50 grand and we'll pump that into Google. And if you generate X number of leads and if the sales, are more than 50 grand, then, keep pumping it in. And it was a pretty easy kind of conversation to have. And we genuinely used to look at it kind of at the big end of town and the big agencies and talking about brand and whatever else, going, all they're doing is hiding. They're not willing to kind of come to the party by way of metrics, and that definitely changed, right? I think we saw that in digital, things became far less linear. This perfect kind of one or two touch path to conversion. Maybe drive with Google, retarget with Facebook, and that kind of is your marketing funnel. And I think for the last kind of 8 to 10 years, that's been firmly shattered, right? And digital now is just as complex and confusing and confounding as traditional marketing. And like, we are constantly trying to educate our clients that, like, if you come into it saying, I will make all my decisions based on data, you are setting yourself up to fail tremendously quickly. That's not to say that measurement isn't important. It really is. Attribution is more flawed than I think most marketers are willing to ever kind of agree with. And I think it is really challenging where we've... admit. And I think part of it is, like, we've educated business owners and C-suite and CFOs and whoever else over the last 20 years that everything can now be measured. I will make all my decisions based on data, and it's actually not how marketing works in the real world. So it is such a challenge. Like, how do you go about, or I guess, what are you observations of the best teams that you work with, how they kind of have those conversations, how you bring non-marketing stakeholders on the journey?
It is a measurement is a challenge. These are long-term brand, they talk about long-term brand building. Things don't move overnight. Brent Smart, who's now CMO at Telstra, used to be CMO at IAG. He used to say, I know this will work, but I'm worried that they'll turn the taps off before it does, them being the board, etc. Kind of, so he kind of quite famously went in there and shifted into this much more kind of emotional space, is kind of betting on brands, really, and which is also doing at Telstra now. And that, that's the issue, is always been finding the evidence that it is working. How do I know that this is going to work in the long term versus How do I know that this hasn't worked yet versus it's never going to work? That's why it's not showing up, and that's very hard. And finding the right metrics, finding that kind of the evidence of pressure for change is really hard. And I do actually think so. I'll talk a little bit about what I do think works, but I do think that's where this empirical evidence is really helping, because I can't show you that it's working for our campaign, but here is the evidence that this is how this stuff works. I think really helps those arguments. I think for years, people have wanted to be able to show they've got that brand advertising is important, and they've wanted to be able to show that the work they're doing is having an impact, but finding the metrics that show that is very, very hard. And then you're against the sea of other metrics that go, here you go, I can show you exactly how this stuff's working. So the empirical, the studies, all that kind of stuff really helps with that. I think it is about having sensitive measures in your brand tracking. Hopefully, if you have brand tracking, and again, there's been lots of entrants in the market who I won't talk too much about because they're largely in some way or shape or form competitors to ours. But basically, they're people who they're setting up, easy to use brand tracking for people who probably can't really afford to do it otherwise, or might not be able to get that over the line, so that people have something to go on. And so that some of that stuff's good as long as it's sensitive enough, as long as it's not the measure, it's going to show that change sensibly over time. And I say sensibly, there's no point building something that just changes overnight, doesn't reflect reality, because no one believes it then. But the other thing is, it's a really good, there's been a lot of work done around share of search, and that's just a really good metric of share of organic search, a really good lead indicator of that your brand is getting more mental availability and being seen more. It doesn't tell you much more than that. It just tells you that bit of the picture. If you think about a marketing funnel, the bottom half of the marketing is inherently measurable. They get into, they've come to your site, maybe they log in, register, etc. They convert, all of those kind of things. You can measure those bits quite easily, but it's the top that you can't measure very easily. You can kind of measure awareness and things like that in a relatively straightforward way, but it's the middle bit that's a bit messy, and that's where things like share of search have been found to be quite useful proxies for those kind of things. But
Rand Fishkin, who's purely digital, like he's kind of founded Moz back in the day. He's a search marketer. He's now got some kind of market audience research software that kind of works a hell of a lot better in North America and Europe than it does here, just based on the data that he's got access to. But he's kind of at war with attribution, and his line is measurement isn't broken, but attribution is.
Yeah.
And even putting all the offline stuff to the side, he talks a lot about the best forms of digital marketing. The most effective forms of digital marketing are the least easy to measure.
Yeah.
And so it will be things around, content marketing. It'll be stuff being shared in messaging platforms where links and credit and analytics don't kind of function. It'll be podcasts. People, and it's true for us, right? People listen to this podcast and might reach out to me in 2 years' time, and they've been listening. Yes, they're just kind of a number, but so hard to track that,
You can measure if you're lucky, you can measure the outcome, but you can't attribute it to where it came from. So,
very, very challenging, right? Versus bottom of the funnel brand search and whatever else, so easy to measure, Facebook last click, etc. What do you? Because I suspect that there'll be listeners to the pod who, might be operating in a corporate such as similar to a Woolies or a CommBank, and they'll have agencies like yours or specialist teams doing a lot of this brand tracking stuff. You mentioned some competitive offerings to you with pros and cons, but what are your suggestions to, say, someone in the mid-market? Like, how do you get brand tracking going if you don't have huge budgets to spend on it, but you still want to be able to do it in a way that, is that the kind of thing your business would still do? You'd have kind of a slimmed down offering, or how does it work?
Yeah, we have as I said, we work with all sorts of businesses, sizes, varieties, all sorts of things, slow moving, fast moving. So we don't really have off the shelf products. So we build it whatever's right for them. And some of it's very simple. Some of it's about frequency. So there's lots of clients where we do 1 dip a year, maybe, or even 2-3 dips a year versus people like Woolworths, we're measuring constantly for them. So that's one way to make it more affordable, and you can learn a hell of a lot in that time, with that one piece, because you're getting all of the interplay between the data, just not over time. There are kind of more frequent trimmed down options available. They're not necessarily as efficient because a lot of the cost and research is finding the people and getting them to answer surveys and things. So once you've got them, you're better to ask them more questions. But it depends on that. Then it comes down to what your category, what's your category, and how fast moving how fast moving is your brand, and are you a startup? So therefore, you might. Big brands don't move very fast. Startups can move a little bit more quickly, but yeah, we're working with some startups in the fintech space, and we're doing 2 dips a year for them, aligned with when their campaigns are, so that we're seeing the post impact of their campaign, and each dip is effectively the pre-wave for the next dip. So,
and how do you do it in because I get with B2C,
yeah,
kind of getting out there, big data sets, lots of people you can go into. I suspect you just get a big enough audience that statistically it's relevant.
Great. Yeah.
How does it work where you're trying to? We've got a client, for instance, who their target market, there's 16,000 B2B prospects for them in the entire country, right? How would you? And I suspect in the fintech example, it might be similar if it's B2B. How do you go about running brand tracking in those types of environments?
It can be really challenging, and the challenge is getting to the right people, obviously, all research back into the right people, but the right people in the right businesses. We can have a client who's targeting small businesses, and we can go out and talk to 200-300 for small businesses, but they're the wrong kind of small business. They're just not interested in what they're doing. So getting that, and obviously sometimes it's very hard to define a target market for particularly a startup who might be kind of almost creating a market. So that can be really challenging. You just the research panels are available for those things. You just have to work with smaller sample sizes, largely, but of course they're representing a much smaller group of the population, so you can kind of get away with that to a degree. What we're increasingly talking to our people, like if clients like that came to us, you can spend a lot of money, especially if you're a startup. You can spend a lot of money to find the right people to talk to and find out that your awareness is 5, 6, 7, 8%, right? So that's I wouldn't say the rest of the survey you do with them or the interview you do with them is wasted, but because you can find out about your competitors and you can find out the dynamics in the market, but you can't find out much about what they know about you because you just don't have the base size to do that. When you take 400 people and say 10% of them aware, that's 40 people. So we've often start recommending now that people instead do a series of what in the industry we call more IDIs, depth interviews, basically. So they're one-on-one interviews, for semi-structured interviews, 20, 30, 45 minutes with people. And you're not going to get a complete like for like, last wave we're at 50%, now we're at 56%, but you're going to get a better idea of, you're going to make more use of that time with those people to really find out a lot more about the category dynamics and where their brand's at. Now, because if your number one thing is I need evidence to show to my board or whatever that the stuff's working, maybe that's not going to work, because you're not going to be able to say it was 56 and now it's 60. You're going to say more of the people we talked to felt more favorably about us this time, but without putting a real number on it. So if you're after real evidence, it does get quite hard. Maybe things like share of search come into play there. It is a common problem. There are specialist B2B agencies, but they tend to focus on the kind of more common, like finance and things like that. So they tend to focus on that kind of end of town. Having said that, we do a business tracker for Combank, and we speak to a few hundred people every month in that. So but that's fairly broad reaching, obviously.
Yeah.
So it's all doable. It's just a little bit more pricey than doing consumer interviewing, unfortunately. But it's really about, I'd much rather have a smaller sample of the right people than someone deliver you a sample that's kind of ostensibly your target market but isn't really, and therefore, it's just like, well, this doesn't make sense. They're not talking the right language. You show your client shows data to their stakeholders, and it's like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why would they say that? But because they're not the right people. You're talking to plumbers when you need to be talking to I don't know, IT people in tech companies and things. So you've got to kind of I go less of the right people, which sounds like fairly obvious, quality over quantity, but people chase kind of statistical numbers when actually that's only statistically valid if the sample's valid in the first place. So.
Yeah, and I think the challenge there, I think you touched on it, right? Which is, I think the thing is, non-marketers want simple answers. Things that are actually just complex and nuanced and difficult, and that's the reality of it. I think we joked about the Mark Ritson course, but a few of the things that kind of remain with me. The first one was great marketing starts with research. And he talked a lot about quality. Yeah, I did. Wasn't just copying all your notes. But then the qualitative research, you can rely on a surprisingly small number of respondents. Once you start getting past a pretty small number, things don't really materially change very much. And you can really lean on that pretty heavily.
100%. And that's the thing to do. And I mean, we do qualitative research for consumer companies as well, for B2C as well, obviously, but for B2B, it's often it's where I think people should go. However, a lot of the time we get that call, because we get the call from that person because they want to prove a case or show something internally, and therefore they want numbers. And that's where I think it's do the qual bit, do the depth interviews, and then align that with some of the marketing evidence that's out there these days. And some of that, obviously a lot of that evidence talks in a consumer space for obvious reasons, but there's a lot of evidence that all absolutely holds true into a B2B space. People are people after all. There's actually arguments people make decisions more emotionally in B2B than they do in B2C, because they have reputations to maintain, jobs to keep, and all that kind of stuff. They are risking more than, if you make a decision as a person for something for your own benefit, you're only risking you or your dissatisfaction or your whatever buying a drink that you don't like the taste of. Whereas if you're buying something on a B2B, you could let a lot of people down. So people actually make more emotional decisions in B2B.
It's quite interesting in that I've got the post in front of me now. I kind of collated my favorite kind of 8 takeaways from Byron's presentation, and one of them was just simply B2B is hard, and it was very interesting. I would suggest that probably half of the comments where there was actually discussion being had, probably more, were from B2B marketers, kind of questioning a lot of Byron Sharp's work in the space, kind of suggesting that not all of it necessarily related to them. It was kind of an interesting viewpoint from B2B marketers.
I think some of it does, and some, all of these Byron, Mark Ritson, all of these people, they have to go out with a very strong opinion down one channel, and well, actually, that's not true. Mark Ritson is, as he always likes to say, a bothist, but people like Byron Sharp kind of stick to their guns on this stuff. And I think a lot of the thing that absolutely rings true from all of that work is, all that body of evidence and work, is the idea of mental availability, of just making sure your brand is known for things. Or how heavy and light category buyers and stuff. Sometimes that flies out the window when you're in a B2B space. You're not going to be a heavy category buyer of complicated IT systems, right? You've got one or none. And so I think a lot of that stuff kind of flies out the window. I think there's other stuff that I personally just don't necessarily believe in, and a lot of other people don't, which is about there's no such thing as differentiation. I don't think that's true, but that's not so much a B2B, B2C thing, though. That's just that I don't necessarily buy into that. But there's some really good evidence I've seen recently around just things like in a buying group, if there's a buying group to make a B2B decision, I can't remember the stat off my top of my head, but let's say it's basically 90% of the time, the decision will go to a supplier, brand, company, organization, whatever, who everybody in that buying group had heard of before that process started, and that on hardly ever does this decision go to the experts within that buying group's recommendation if that differs from everyone else's. So if it was an IT expert in a broader decision-making group and they said this is the mainframe we should go for, or whatever, anyone buys mainframes these days. They go. If that differed from what everyone else is, it would very rarely go, because ultimately they'd back down, because it's not worth their job to. It's the nobody got sacked for choosing IBM thing, right? It's ultimately not worth it for them, so they don't. But what that means is the how brands grow, Byron Sharp stuff around mental availability, and that you should target everyone, not just target narrowly, absolutely rings true. You need the CFO to have heard of you, not just the person who is dealing with whatever specific thing you're trying to sell to them, because that will make the purchase go through much more strongly. That doesn't mean you need to take the CFO to the Swans game or take them out for dinner or anything, but what that means is you need to have some above the line advertising, or some kind of advertising that they are going to see when they're not in the market for it. CFO doesn't care about mainframes. They're not going to read the IT magazines, or again, I don't think anyone reads IT magazines anymore. But
let's call it a CRM, Nick.
Yeah, CRM. Yeah. Your world, not mine. But they are going to be watching the footy and see an ad at the footy, or see your sign, your banners around the edge of the pitch and things. So that's the kind of idea that you need to be known amongst those people, so that when someone goes, "Hey, I reckon we should go with Rocket," and they go, "Oh yeah, I've heard of them. I've heard their podcast. Cool. Okay, they seem like good guys. Let's go with them," kind of thing. So that's the idea, and that's an idea that is now being talked about as being called. James Herman, who I mentioned before, is talking about this idea of future demand and current demand, which is really just a relabeling, by his own admission, is really just a relabeling of the kind of brand investment versus performance investment, the long and the short of it thing. But it's a better language to understand how to kind of convince people why that brand investment is important. It's not about, oh, we must build brands. Well, why? It's saying we are creating or tapping into future demand. We're getting people primed so that when they are in a decision-making process, capacity, whatever, that our name is in their head, and therefore that smooths that purchase, smooths that decision making.
100%. I find it really frustrating, and it is kind of hard, right? Because we're a full service digital marketing agency, so we wouldn't speak about being a performance agency, right? We do lots of work in channels that are traditionally viewed as performance channels, but Google SEO, that can be top of the funnel. SEO performs much better in B2B than it does in B2C because of that long buyer journey content, top of the funnel type stuff. And it can be really frustrating where a client or prospective client will come to us, and we have and do lots of work in B2B SaaS, and it'll be, hey, awesome news, we've got 50 grand, 100 grand to put into this campaign to, the next quarter to drive, demand gen, drive performance for the sales team. And the bit of software that they're selling is, similar to a CRM, probably something that gets put into a business once every 5 years. It'll be something that gets put into a business every 3 years. It'll be something that, there might come a critical moment sometime in the next 1, 2, 3, 4 years where you will make a decision like that, but you can't force it. And it is kind of the 95-5 rule, which I think most marketers would be aware of, which is, in most markets, only 5% of a market are in market at that moment. But in complex sales like this, it's probably far less than that, right? You're probably 99.1. And that, I've got the article up here. It's what B2Bs need to know about their buyers. And I think that's where that stat you were mentioning before, which is 80 to 90% of respondents, depending on what they are buying, have a set of vendors in mind before they do any research. And just as importantly, 90% of them will ultimately choose a vendor from that day one list. So the idea that you're just going to come in there and play in the space when people are bottom of the funnel in Google looking to plug a CRM in, too late. Salesforce, HubSpot, they've been doing that marketing for the last 10 years, right? And that's not to suggest that every listener on this, on the pod today should be taking out airport, space and billboards and football stadiums, but it is to put yourself into the mindset of your buyer. How often, are your services procured? Who are you competing with? How do you get into the mindset of your future buyer? Because I literally sent, got a client awesome client, they're really receptive to this stuff, right? But they have a double problem. One is there's a very low awareness of their category, right? They think there's somewhere between 5 to 10% of prospective buyers would even be aware that their category exists. And within that, they're probably actually quite well known. But yeah, I literally sent 3 copies of How Brands Grow and 3 copies of The Long and the Short of It to help them have those conversations with other stakeholders in their businesses, because they've kind of tapped out. They're getting roughly half of the sales that happen every year in that category. So it's actually about how do we grow the pie, right? Which separate but related concepts.
Yeah, which is when we hear a lot from startups, scale-ups, whatever you want to call them, where they've gone through their low-hanging fruit. They've gone through the kind of the people who are just sitting there waiting for them to exist, and then it's like, right, and now maybe they've got some VC investment with some kind of massive growth trajectory planned or expected, and it's like, right, now how do we move it? And that's where it's like, okay, now we need to actually. And I think the challenge there is, okay, some of that they need immediately, but the reality is what they now need to start doing is actually properly investing in the brand, which is sales they'll only see 2-3 years down the track. But the important, like the long and the short of it, as many people say, the most important word is the and. Like, you've got to, to your example about the 95%, the 5%, the selling the software that they buy every 3 years. It's like you have to do the brand work. You have to do the activation that means that you're the one that's on their shortlist that they actually choose, or that you make that as frictionless as possible. So you've got to do both bits of it, but the weight of the spend needs to be much more in favor of the long than the short, as it kind of famously goes into. But it's also the, coming back to Byron Sharp, the double jeopardy thing, right? The big brands just win more. It's just easier for the big brands to keep winning because they are mentally available. They are on that shortlist in the first place. They will get their unfair share of the decisions just because they're there and people know about them, even though they're not necessarily in fact, quite often aren't the superior option.
It's the safe bet, right?
Safe bet, yeah.
Yeah, and I think most marketers a lot of this would not come as a surprise, right? And I think these are the conversations that are taking place within marketing teams, pressure being put on marketing teams a different level of effectiveness, trying to kind of educate and push back internally. I really like the kind of current demand versus future demand terminology. I think it, because brand quite wrongly has a bad name. It's like, it's all pretty pictures, and it's fluff. We all feel different towards brand, and how you feel about a Nike is how I feel different, and blah blah blah. What I guess comment would you have around this concept of future demand, and how does a business set themselves up to kind of make sure that marketing and advertising is as effective as possible?
I think the mindset, and when you start thinking about things in this, you see advertising, communications, marketing in quite a different light. And that is that for that 95% who aren't in the market, they're therefore not going to be accepting, susceptible, etc., to messages that are rational, are about the product, about its features. They're not interested. They're not in the market. Why would they be interested in that? So therefore, the job of all your communications is to engage them in some way or another. Could be humor, could be drama, whatever. Like, there's emotional, people talk about, but the point is that, which is mostly true, but it's really about engaging them, because you've got to capture their attention, because they're not looking for whatever widget you're selling. You've got to capture their attention, hold it, and leave them with your brand name, and ideally with some kind of idea of not what you do, but some of what bucket to put that in their mind, I guess. So, I mean, Byron Sharp would talk about category entry points, but whether you believe in that or not, that you need to kind of associate them with something. You need to know where they might crop up again. But the number one thing is engage people and leave them with the brand, because that's how you, and maybe some just broad positive feelings. You don't want to leave them with engage them and think negatively about you. So, and if you start looking at a lot of advertising through that lens, then you realize the advertising that's been done for 30, 40, 50 years, like, the beer ads, for instance, the classic Carlton beer ads in Australia, a lot of that kind of stuff, a lot of those big emotional brand campaigns, what would be called emotional brand campaigns, are doing just that. They are just trying to entertain you. And this idea that, oh, but what's the message, or it's not telling me why, or that doesn't matter. You are lodging the brand as long as they're well branded. And I think that's the other thing that's changed, is this huge focus on distinctive brand assets, brand cues, whatever you want to call them, which still sadly is lacking in a lot of advertising, but it's really, really crucial. And so that you are getting the benefit of that engagement. Otherwise, it's not doing anything for you. So it's fine if it doesn't say anything, but people go, oh, but what does that say about the brand? And when I say people, I mean marketers, market researchers, people in the industry still say that, and they go, but that actually, when you start thinking it through that lens, that doesn't matter. As long as they're engaged, we're left with a relatively positive feeling, a positive feeling, but it doesn't need to be a specific one, and we're left with the brand name. Then actually you've done that work. So coming back to our example about the CFO who doesn't know anything about mainframes, you don't want to talk about mainframes. You want to engage them with something. If you're talking cross tracks or something like that, right? Classic B2B kind of digital cross tracks, etc. Trying to get to a business audience because they're commuting, all that kind of stuff. Engage them. You have to just make them look up from their phone and look at your ad and pay attention long enough to actually take out the brand name. And there are loads and loads of examples. When you start looking for that, you see it all the time and all over the place. And again, as you say, a lot of people are doing this already. It's just when you think in that nature, actually it puts a bit more kind of not rigor around what you're doing, but it makes people see what you're doing and what you're trying to achieve, rather than just trying to start slamming stuff full of proof points and reasons to believe and things like that, because you don't need them for the 95%. You absolutely need them for the 5%, but not for the 95%.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I was at a session week before last, and I'll try to remember the source and put it in the show notes, but it was something around like 2.5% of advertising actually gets seen each day. And then the follow on from that was that we incorrectly, and it probably speaks a little bit to your point around that kind of unfair benefit of just being a big brand, right?
Yep.
We incorrectly attribute roughly 40% of advertising to the category leader. So if you're cooking dinner and you hear a soft drink kind of fizz in the background, it's Coke. If you see a burger being seared, it's a Big Mac. If you see someone running through a trail in the rain, it's Nike. It's much harder for the kind of the gritty underdog, right, to kind of to cut through in the same way that the category leader does.
Which creates a real challenge, because I've just said you've got to be engaging, but you've also got to be heavily branded. So you can't just be a walking logo, because that doesn't work. I think that's why out of home's having a massive renaissance, and I think that is possible. I mean, there's a couple of reasons why. One of them I'd say there's three reasons why. One of them is it's one of the only ways to reach everybody these days, because of the fragmentation of other media. Digital means you can plaster the city with your stuff rather than having to pay for a number of specific sites. But the third is, I think that it is allowing people, particularly with digital now, so the billboards, the out of home can be moving images. You can now engage people, and they're inherently branded environments. Your brand is just sitting there often, so you can't get away from the brand. Whereas have a 30, 60 second beautiful TV ad, and I say beautiful and beautifully crafted, you have to work hard to get your brand in that ad, because maybe it can have a role, and those are always the best ones, is whether it's funny and engaging anyway, but also the brand has a role to play, so it makes sense. But actually, also often the best thing to do is just if you really do engage people, they'll take the brand out at the end. I often treat brand association scores as almost a diagnostic for the campaign as well, because unless they're walking logo kind of things, it's kind of showing whether people bothered to pay attention and remember it. So yeah, you've then got this paradox. You've got to I need to heavily brand stuff, but also entertain, which there lies the creative challenge. That's why creative agencies exist and all of that kind of stuff. But it is hard. But it's the classic kind of, if you're Combank, don't put people in a blue shirt, put them in a yellow. Well, you don't have to be in a yellow shirt, but don't be in a blue or red shirt. Don't be in that kind of stuff. And you see so much of that now. A Woolies ad, everybody will be wearing somewhere along the line shades of green, whereas when we are still working with them, but 10 years ago there were still people in red in their ads. It's like, you don't have to shove it down people's throats, but just don't give clues in the other direction either. But yeah,
It's really interesting. We had Josh Gurgel from O Media on the pod. It was a while back now, but if you're interested, it's definitely an episode worth listening to, and it's on the website. And he also talked a lot, and I couldn't agree with you more on those kind of three drivers of outdoor. He talked also a lot about context, where outdoor media has, and it probably ties into the creative part that you touched on, but you do have this kind of ability to play around geography in a way that a lot of other media forms don't have. I think Cooper's Beer have always done a really awesome job of outdoor advertising, whether it's near pubs where they do have beer or near pubs they don't have beer. There's one near a kind of a tire repair place on Parramatta Road where they've always had fun with that.
Yeah,
we did some work for Urban Surf around the time of the Australian Open, and they've got a big centre near Melbourne Airport, and just the ability to kind of tie in the location, being so close to the surf thing and playing on the kind of tennis thing that was going on. And you do just have this ability to tie in geo, which I think is fun as well. Well, Nick, it's been an awesome conversation. As you know, we generally finish the pod with what's that one piece of advice that you'd give to an in-house marketer. Having been on the pod before, I think maybe it'd be great if you could kind of steer it in the direction of this topic, like for listeners that are interested in learning more, what resources, what direction would you push them in, either for themselves or for other stakeholders in their business if they're trying to do a better job of kind of engaging them and kind of bringing them along on the journey?
Yeah, so I mean, you've mentioned two of them already, how brands grow, which with the caveat over, I don't think all of that is, I think a few people agree that not all of that is perhaps relevant to B2B. A lot of it is, but some of it just doesn't stretch in that space. Long and short of it, of course. And then the James Herman work on future demand versus current demand. Now, that is available as a PDF somewhere, but it has also been released as a book, which means it's now quite hard to find for free. But there's definitely talks on it. So you can definitely, so if you just search James, well, actually, if you just search future demand versus current demand, you'll probably find it. But otherwise, James Herman, which is James and Hurman, but I'm sure you'll put some notes, put that in the put some links in the show notes. So that's really good because that makes some really clear, compelling, data-driven arguments for how the stuff works. And then what else is there? What's the Rory Southern's? That's not really. I was trying to think. There's just a whole lot of stuff, and it's like hard to kind of go look here for it because what's all the stuff that's been done, like the System 1 stuff and all that, but I don't know quite how to. Oh, okay, no, I've got one. Okay. The other thing is they haven't done anything for a little while, but LinkedIn has a B2B institute which applies, calls on a lot of these people and applies some of the stuff and tests whether it's true in B2B. So that stuff's always really good to look at and been done in partnership with a lot of these guys. And then some of the stuff that System 1 do, so they're UK-based advertising research brand, but they work globally, and really their point is around building emotion and advertising. They've done a lot of work with James Herman. They've done a lot of work with Mark Ritson, possibly even Byron Sharp, I think, and certainly with Les Bonet and Peter Field, who wrote Long and the Short of It. So they're kind of quite an interesting one to kind of look into their ecosystem in terms of a lot of the research they've done to prove this kind of stuff as well. So, but yeah, future demand versus current demand. I've read all of this stuff in the past, but that was something that made me really start rethinking the way I saw some of the stuff and reframing the way we talk about it. And I think that's a really, really good piece to look at. So we'll definitely get James to put the link in the notes for that.
Awesome, mate. Great conversation. And thank you so much for sharing so much with the listeners.
No worries. Pleasure.